General characteristics of Romanticism, Part 2. Now, a few of the key characteristics that define the Romantic style have already been discussed, and today we will go through few more. The list of the characteristics of Romanticism, however, is not definitive, as the term Romanticism has been used in varying sense, and it has been difficult for the critics to give a satisfactory definition to Romanticism. We'll try and encompass as many of the characteristics as we can. The Romantics were greatly influenced by the humanitarian philosophy of Rousseau, and they took great interest in humanity, and they dealt with the lives of the common men and women. They were concerned about the common man of the society and for his well-being, and in their works they depict the simple life of the lower strata of the society, that is, the downtrodden, the sufferers, the orphans. This contrasts with the exclusionist nature of the neoclassical literature, which dealt with the urban and the aristocratic class. The Romantics glorified the simplicity and innocence of the peasants, the workers, the children, as against the neoclassists who glorified the lords and fashionable boys in their works. The Romantics were inspired by the ideals of French Revolution of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Wordsworth celebrates and sings the simplicity and commonplace signs of life. He is of the opinion that simple living and return to natural surroundings is the only solution to the human sufferings, and to him goes the credit for enlarging the domain of English poetry. He does not praise the lords and the kings, but rather talks about the pain and the pleasure of the rustics. He considered man to be a fit subject for poetic composition, and he was deeply concerned with their primary feelings and affections. So he wrote about the peasants and the rustics who lived in close proximity to nature. The poetry of Wordsworth, Shelley, and Byron was colored by a feeling of humanitarianism, and we see that Shelley and Byron revolted against the world as it existed, and they tried hard to usher in the golden age. So the romantic poetry is seen to be the glorification of the natural man, the noble savage, and its focus has been on the primitive and the untutored personality. Humanism could be traced both in the poetry and the prose works of the Romantic period, and Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Byron are considered to be the greatest humanists. Romanticism is known for its turn to subjectivism, the impulse to look for truth inwardly, and subjective poetry is a kind of poetry in which the poet goes into himself and finds his inspiration from his own experiences, thoughts, and feelings. The Romantics were concerned not so much with the external facts of life as with their own feelings and emotions. They gave free expressions to their emotions. In the neoclassical period, objectivity was preferred, but subjectivity prevailed in the age of Romanticism, and to such an extent that objective realities of life were given the subjective interpretations. Romantic poetry became individualistic in its approach, and the celebration of I, the self, reached its ultimate grandeur in the Romantic poetry. Poetry to the Romantics was the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and they laid emphasis on intuition rather than on the observation of set rules. So we find that there is a free expression in the poetry of the Romantic period, and Wordsworth holds that one must look inward to the way that past experiences are reshaped anew in the memory, quotes within quotes recollected in tranquility. Now Wordsworth praises the mind as a mansion for all lovely forms, and the memory as a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies. To Keats, truth is essentially subjective, for in beauty is truth, truth beauty. Keats stresses that the poet has a negative capability to ignore the logical disturbances of reason in order to focus on the subjective feeling of mystery that results. So the Romantics they showed a more subjective approach in examining their surroundings, and we see that the Romantic poetry is intuitive, introspective, and is often marked by the fantastic. Romanticism is characterized by an instinct for the elemental simplicities of life. The Romantic poets they showed great love for the ordinary, and they tried to bring people back to nature and recover us from the redundant conventions. As a result of this, childhood was idealized by Blake and Wordsworth, and the simple innocent natures by Burns, Wordsworth, and Coleridge. The great romantic poets found inspiration in the simple things of everyday life, like the nightingale, the west wind, the skylark, an ordinary sunset, the daffodils. So Wordsworth, in his preface to the second edition of the lyrical ballad, observes, quote, "The principal object then proposed in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout and to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect." Unquote. So we see that the number of romantic poems like the daffodils, to the daisy, to the skylark, to ode to the west wind are all fine examples of how commonplace subject were used as the subject matter by the romantic poets. The Romantics' interest in the past led them to experiment with the old meters and poetic forms. The popular heroic couplet of the 18th century gave place to various stanza forms. The Spenserian stanza, the ballad, the blank verse, the lyric were all revived. The metrical peculiarities of the old ballad gave fresh inspiration to great poets like Coleridge and Keats, and a variety in metrical forms created a new melody in English poetry. The Romantic poets gave a variety of poetic style, and this could be seen in Wordsworth's simple and natural style, Coleridge's wonderful music, Byron's oratorical style, Shelley's rich harmonies, and Keats' picaresque word painting. So these poets they gave a new style, a unique style to English poetry. The poetry of the Romantic Revival was also a revolt against the neoclassical poetry of the 18th century, and therefore this movement is also called the Romantic Revolt. The Romantic poets opposed the tendencies of the 18th century poetry. 18th century poetry was governed by set rules and regulations, but the poetry of Romantic Revival protested against the bondages of rules and customs. The 18th century poetry was concerned with clubs and coffee houses, drawing room, and social and political life of London. Nature had no place in it. It was specially the poetry of town life. But in the poetry of the Romantic Revival, the interest of poets moved from town to country life and from the artificial beauty of drawing rooms to the natural beauty and loveliness of nature. With the publication of the lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge in 1798, was ushered in a new era of romance and liberalism in English poetry, which smashed the old artificial, superfluous, and hackneyed theory of poetry of the neoclassical age. Shelley was a great rebel and a reformer. He was a revolutionary idealist and a prophet. He opposed the long cherished conventions and all the existing institutions and traditions of human society. He was a rebel against society and he was against all the existing institutions and conventions and traditions of human society. He was against monarchy, against church, and against all the social institutions that suppressed mankind. He had a revolutionary zeal and he encouraged Englishmen to fight against their masters. All his poetry, excluding the personal lyrics, show his rebellious nature and his reformative zeal. Byron also criticized the bourgeois life because he had a grudge against that society. He was against the rules of conventional morality and he advocated the cause of liberty, and his heart moved with anger against despots and tyrants.